Vamos iniciar a terceira jornada de hoje, né? Tivemos de manhã a apresentação de comunicações, à tarde tivemos uma oficina de artes plásticas e agora à noite vamos ouvir a conferência da professora Stacy Friend. E eu queria só convidá-los, né, antes da gente de passar a palavra para a Stacy, queria convidá-los a participarem amanhã. De manhã também teremos comunicações, à tarde temos a oficina de teatro e à noite a mesa redonda com a professora Renata Sá e o professor Antônio Rogério Toscano. Bem, então passo a apresentar agora a professora Stacy. A professora Stacy leciona filosofia. Ela foi professora durante os anos de 2005 a 2007 no Birkbeck College, que pertence à Universidade de Londres, e voltou para essa universidade em 2014. Nesse meio tempo, ela lecionou no Washington and Jefferson College, em Washington, e na Universidade de Michigan. Ela é vice-presidente da Sociedade Britânica de Estética e as suas pesquisas se centram principalmente em temas relativos à intersecção da estética, mente e linguagem, especialmente aqueles que se relacionam com problemas levantados pela nossa relação com narrativas ficcionais. Ela tem publicado artigos acerca da natureza dos nomes, da ficção, a metafísica ficcional das personagens. Então, passo a palavra agora à professora Stacy.
Thank you very much, Sonia, and thanks for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here, and I apologize that I'm speaking in English. My Portuguese is non-existent, so this is better. All right, I'll get right into it. Can everyone hear me? All right, okay. So this talk is part of a larger project. I'm working on a book called Matters of Fact and Fiction, in which I defend the claim that fictional literature essentially involves facts, is essentially about reality in an important sense. And just to give you a little background on the project and my assumptions, which we can discuss later if people want to, fiction in the sense that I'm going to use the term is contrasted with nonfiction, where both fiction and nonfiction are kinds of representation. So the difference isn't between fiction and reality, or fiction and something made up. Rather, it's between fiction and nonfiction, two different kinds of representation. And I give an account of the distinction between fiction and nonfiction as genres, right? So the idea is that when we think about works of fiction, works of fictional literature, that isn't to be contrasted necessarily with something like truth or reference or beliefs or so on. And as a result, works of fiction can engage our beliefs and our attitudes and potentially teach us something about the world. All right, so here's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to talk about a concept that's quite common in my domain in philosophy: what's true in a story? What is so according to a story, right? What's the plot? Who are the characters? And so on. And what I'm going to argue is that our starting point for interpreting fictional literature, as well as nonfiction, but I'm going to focus on fiction, is the assumption that the work is about the real world, right? That's ultimately, I'll argue, why we care about fiction, why we care about fictional characters, how we learn, and so on. And then I'm going to suggest, in line with the theme of the conference, that this starting point for interpretation constrains an author's creativity in an important respect. Okay. So that's the basic overview. So let me say something about this concept of truth in a story. So there's widespread agreement among philosophers, people in literary studies, people who study narrative, psychologists, and so on, that in order to understand a story, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, doesn't matter, you have to fill in the gaps of the explicit text. You have to make inferences from what's said in order to understand what else is going on in the story. So what is story true, or in my terminology, storified, or what obtains according to the story, goes beyond what's explicit and may contradict it. So if you take an example like Vladimir Nabokov's novel Lolita, you have a narrator, Humbert Humbert, who's a very unreliable narrator. Right? He's either self-deceived or he's deceiving us. And so when he says things like Lolita is his willing partner, we're not supposed to believe that that's really what is happening in the story. Right? So what's explicit isn't necessarily what we infer is actually going on in the world of the story. So philosophers ask two questions about this idea, truth in a story. What does it mean to say that something is storified, or that something obtains according to a story? Right? What is happening in a story is often not actually true. So what does it mean to say something happens in a story? And the second question, which is going to be my main focus, is how do we determine what is going on in a story, right? How do we generate all of the different story truths, as they're called? So with respect to this first question of what it means to talk about truth in a story, it's important that when philosophers, and I come from the analytic tradition in philosophy, ask these kinds of questions, what's going on in a story, they're not focused on what you might think of as the really interesting questions, the controversial questions about interpretation. That isn't the focus. The focus is really on uncontroversial descriptions of the story world. So all of us will agree, for example, that a particular character has arms and legs, even if the story never says that the character has arms and legs, right? And the question that philosophers ask is, why are we so sure? How do we know, right? So we're concerned with cases where there's agreement about what's going on in the story, that is, what's storified. And what we want to know is, what are we agreeing about and how do we know? So this is just an example of philosophers being puzzled by what's obvious to everyone, right? So you don't normally have to, that something is true in a story. I defend a claim that's quite common in analytic philosophy, which is that a work invites us to imagine something. Okay? And I'll say something about what that means in more detail later, but the basic idea is that when you're reading a story and you come across a particular claim or you make an inference to something that's implied, for example, you know, to keep with the Dona Flor example, you know Vadinho has returned from the dead to give Dona Flor pleasure. When you know that, I say you're being invited to imagine it, right? So that's what it means to say that it obtains in the story, is that you're supposed to imagine it. What does it mean to imagine in the relevant sense? You're supposed to imagine a story world. That's the idea, which means constructing a certain kind of complex mental representation. So this is something that psychologists call either a mental model or a situation model. So basically, as you're reading, you get introduced to characters, they do things, things happen to them, and you represent these things as developing in your mind as you're reading. You imagine them occurring. That's the basic idea. So what a work invites you to imagine is what obtains in the story world. That's my background account. Now here is the part that I want to defend today. With respect to how we decide what is actually storified or true in the story, I want to claim that our starting point for that is that we're imagining about the real world. So we take the real world as background when we start reading. And note that this is compatible with a story inviting us to imagine the real world to be very different to how it actually is. Nonetheless, I claim that the stories are inviting us to think about our world, right, as a different kind of place. So the starting point for interpretation that I want to defend, I call the reality assumption. And this says, assume that everything that is really true is storified, right? Everything that actually obtains in the real world can be represented as part of the story world, including all the ordinary mundane facts of the world. So when we ask, how do you know that Donaflor, let's say, has a liver or other internal organs? That's just because people have those things and you know that, and you take that for granted as you're reading. Okay. Now, the reality assumption is just a starting point for interpretation because, of course, most stories, particularly fictional stories, depart from the real world in many different ways. Okay. The most obvious reason that we adjust our reality assumption is explicit content that contradicts reality. So most of the time, when you open up a work of fiction, you're immediately introduced to people who don't exist and events that never happened. So that's the standard. So this is an example from the first paragraph of the posthumous memoirs of Braz Cubas, also translated in English as Epitaph of a Small Winner, for reasons I can't explain. He writes, I am a deceased writer, not in the sense of one who has written and is now deceased, but in the sense of one who has died and is now writing, a writer for whom the grave was really a new cradle. Okay, so this is in the first paragraph of the novel. As soon as you read this, you adjust certain assumptions that you have about reality. For example, ordinarily, people cannot write when they are dead. But in the world of Braz Cubas, someone can write when they're dead, right? So you've just now stepped away from reality. Okay, that's the idea. For even works that are a bit less unrealistic than that, even very realistic works normally require you to imagine people who didn't exist, like Donaflor or Sherlock Holmes or whoever. And even more unrealistic works will require greater departures from reality, right? So if you're reading Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, then you have to suspend everything that you know about the physical laws of the universe, right? So that's a much more radical departure than you get from either Donaflor or Braz Cubas, right? But the important point of the reality assumption is that even when you make these departures from reality, you assume the story truth of whatever aspects of reality remain consistent with the other story truths, and you rely on this when you make further inferences about what is the case according to the story. So you find out right away that Braz Cubas is dead, but when he tells you about his loves and his life, you assume all of that kind of happens in the normal way. You don't assume, well, if he can write when he's dead, then there might be ghosts and fairies everywhere changing everything. You don't do that. You stick with what you know as far as you can. Now, in the discussion of this kind of issue, truth in fiction or truth in a story, the main focus tends to be how we make these inferences. So how we get from what a story actually says to the further story truths. And the usual assumption is that some story truths are directly generated by what's explicit. So for example, we assume the narrator is reliable in Braz Cubas. When he says, I'm dead and I'm writing, we just take that for granted, so it's directly generated. That's a primary story truth. And then we infer other story truths from these, and those are the implied story truths. And there are worries about this picture, such as reliability, but I'll just assume that at least some sentences in a text establish some story truths that we can rely on. So we'll just assume that. So the standard way on that assumption to capture the intuition that the world of a story remains close to reality is with something that's called a reality principle. And this is a very commonly discussed idea. Okay. There are different formulations, but the basic idea is this. Let's assume that the primary story truths obtain. So for example, let's assume that whatever the narrator tells us is the case in the story. Then we ask, what would the world have to be like if that was the case? And then the implied story truths are all the truths that would also obtain in the counterfactual circumstance. So we say, if someone could write while they were dead, what else would have to be true in that world, right? If it were similar to the real world, but it departed in that respect. But there are numerous objections to the reality principle, which is the standard kind of way of approaching this issue. And I want to mention these because I want to distinguish it from this reality assumption that I'm defending. So the reality principle, right, this idea, assume the primary story truths, then try to figure out what else is the case in the story, is too strong because it entails that primary story truths are the only reason for departures from reality. But other considerations might be relevant. So here is an example from a philosopher named David Lewis, who discusses this issue. Suppose that you are reading a traditional fantasy story about knights and dragons, and a new dragon enters the scene, and nothing is said about whether the dragon can breathe fire. Okay, so the story simply says nothing about this. Now, it would be closer to reality to have a dragon that doesn't breathe fire, because reptiles breathing fire is further away from reality, where reptiles don't breathe fire. But that isn't something that you can assume based on the reality principle, because that says, try to make an inference from what's explicit that's as close to possible as reality as possible, rather. Now, the bigger problem from my point of view with the reality principle is that any counterfactual formulation allows for very significant departures from reality. So we're supposed to stay close to reality in deciding what would be true if these primary story truths obtained, but we would have to make adjustments. So the more fantastic a story, the less clear what else is true. So here's an example. In Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, are people familiar with Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy at all? Okay, if you aren't, you should be. So, all right. In Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, I'm going to ruin it now, sorry. The Earth turns out to be a supercomputer designed by intelligent mice. Right? You can travel through space using an infinite improbability drive, which takes you to all points in all universes simultaneously before delivering you randomly to some spot. So in this story, these things are storified, right? Now, given those primary story truths, so much would be so radically different from the way reality actually is that it would be rash for us to make various inferences. For example, right, the main character in the story, Arthur Dent, is one of two humans who's left in the universe after the Earth is destroyed. And we follow Arthur as he responds to the kind of crazy events that he experiences when he meets aliens and travels to other planets. And we make inferences about how Arthur is feeling because he's reacting the way you expect a human being to react in a crazy situation. But how can we be justified in assuming that Arthur Dent's psychology is ordinary human psychology when, after all, he's the product of a supercomputer made by mice? Right? the reality principle doesn't really explain why we simply assume that the psychology of Arthur Dent or the psychology of aliens matches our ordinary psychology. Right? And similarly for novels like Bras Cubas or Dona Flor, which have supernatural elements, if those things really happened, how would we really know what else is going on in this story? Because things would be really different to how they are now. But these kinds of assumptions are necessary to understand these kinds of novels. You couldn't understand Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy if you didn't assume ordinary psychology for the characters, no matter how bizarre they are. Right? So the reality principle doesn't justify our ordinary way of understanding stories. By contrast, the reality assumption that I'm defending is not a mechanism for generating new truths about the story, but rather a starting point for specifying the input into any such mechanism. So facts about the real world are just storified by default. They're not storified as a consequence of a procedure for determining what follows from whatever the story says. So from the start, we're just invited to represent whatever is true as part of the story world, as long as it doesn't contradict other features of the text, including what's explicit, but also the genre and whatever else. And the important point is that when we depart from reality, our departures are localized, right? They're very specific. So in Hitchhiker's Guide, the fact that we exclude all kinds of facts about the physical laws of space travel, just have no implications for psychology. We've assumed ordinary psychology. Nothing in the story requires us to give it up, so we just go on assuming it. We don't worry about whether it obtains in a story that has radically different physical laws. And that's our standard way of interpreting. Now, this does not mean that we should or that we must include every real-world truth in our representation of the story world. And this is where I'll talk a bit about what an invitation is. An invitation to imagine should be contrasted with a mandate, which is an obligation, right? We're mandated to imagine certain things in order to understand a story at a basic level, right? So if you don't understand that Dona Flor's first husband was Vadinho and that he died and that he comes back, then you have missed the most basic parts of the plot. So you're mandated to imagine those things. Okay. A prescription to imagine, I say, I'm just stipulating these terms, is what we must imagine to have a fuller appreciation of a story. So the things that literary critics think about and you pull out from the story and appreciate are things that you should imagine. But an invitation to imagine is defined in this way. You're invited to imagine something if, given a choice between imagining it and not imagining it, you must imagine it. Okay? So, for example, we take for granted that Dona Flor has internal organs. Right? We take for granted she has a liver and kidneys and whatever else is going on. Okay. Now, normally you would never think about this. Okay. It's unusual for people to have to think about characters' insides in most stories. But if the question came up and someone asked, does Dona Flor have normal human physiology inside? The answer to that question is surely yes. She's not an alien, she's not a stranger, or whatever. Okay. So that's the basic idea. You're invited to imagine something if the question came up, it would be obvious that you should imagine it, and the question might never come up and you may never think about it. But that's what an invitation to imagine is. It's also contrasted with what I call an authorization or a permission, what we're permitted to imagine, what's not ruled out. So for example, it may be, I can't remember, that Bras Cubas does not specify his eye color. Okay. and I imagine him with blue eyes, and you imagine him with brown eyes, right? And Sonia doesn't think about his eye color at all. Right? So we're permitted to imagine his eye color any which way, but it's not storified that he has a particular eye color, because if the question came up, there would be no way to decide which eye color he has. Okay. So the basic idea is that you're invited to imagine much more than you should imagine for full understanding, or what you must imagine for minimal understanding, but less than you're allowed to imagine. Okay. And so the idea behind the reality assumption is just that facts about reality are available to us when we need them in order to make inferences from the primary story truths. I'll just skip that. All right. So let me say something about why I think this is the right way to think about our starting point for interpretation. There's actually quite a bit of evidence, empirical evidence for it, in cognitive psychology, which suggests that if we didn't rely on something like the reality assumption, that is, if we didn't take the real world as background to stories, we would have difficulty understanding the basics of any story. So just briefly, there are a number of studies that show that readers automatically use their prior knowledge of the world to make various inferences. In particular, the studies have focused on emotional and spatial inferences. So I'll give you an example. They did a study in which people had to read a short, fairly boring story in which someone named Tom went to the shop of his friend Joe. Joe went to get a drink. Tom steals some money out of the cash register, and later he finds out that Joe was fired because of the missing money. And they wanted to find out if people would automatically assume that Tom felt guilty for having caused the loss of his friend's job. And so they asked people to complete a sentence, Tom felt. And when the next word was guilty, people read the sentence much more quickly than when the next word was something like happy, right? People just paused. In addition, when people were asked just to pronounce various words, they pronounced guilt much faster than words that were contrary to that emotion. And what the researchers concluded was that people had already assumed that Tom felt guilty, and so guilt was very quick for them to think of in a way that wasn't the case for other kinds of emotion. In another study, they found that even when people were asked to read very unrealistic stories with aliens and superheroes and all of this, people assumed that many real-world truths obtained in the story. So they were just given, after they read the story, they were given a list of sentences and asked, is this the case in the world of the story? And most people responded that mathematical truths, like 2 + 2 = 4, obtain even in very unrealistic stories. People have hearts, even in pretty unrealistic stories, and so on. So even when the facts were completely unrelated to the story, nothing was even mentioned about these kinds of issues in the story, people take for granted that the world of the story resembles reality. Now, if this is right, if people are taking this for granted, then we should find that readers have much more difficulty the more unrealistic a story is. And actually, this turns out to be true. So Arthur Grasser, who's a psychologist, and his colleagues did a study of a novel called Einstein's Dreams. And in this novel, in each chapter, Einstein dreams about a place where time works differently to how it works in reality. So for example, in one chapter, time goes backwards. In one chapter, it goes in a circle. In another chapter, it stands still, and so on. And the researchers looked at criticism and saw what inferences you could draw about what was happening in the story, and asked people to say whether or not these things obtained in the story. And what they found was that most readers could draw inferences that were consistent with real-world assumptions about time, but only readers who had studied literature, therefore scored high on a rating of literary expertise, had any success verifying the story truths of inferences that relied on these atypical conceptions of time in the story. The rest did no better than chance. That is, they were 50-50 guessing as to what was happening in this story. They genuinely had no idea. Now that's just a little bit of the evidence that we operate this way. So let's suppose that readers do rely subconsciously on the reality assumption when they're filling in the gaps to understand a story. They're drawing on their knowledge of reality. It doesn't follow that this is what they should be doing, right? Because the reality assumption is a normative claim and not just a descriptive claim. But notice that denying the normative principle would commit us to a massive error theory, because all of the evidence suggests that people actually do make these assumptions about reality when they read. Nonetheless, it's worth considering some of the objections. I'm only going to consider two of the main objections to the reality assumption. Here there are more. Feel free to come up with ones and ask me about them after. So one objection is that not every story is realistic. So here is an example of an unrealistic story which may be familiar. I will read it for translation purposes. Oh no, I'm a bug. Oh no, you're a bug. Yay, you're dead. So if you haven't read Kafka, now you have a summary. All right. Now, if a story is unrealistic, we're going to be often departing from reality in order to understand the story. So maybe this undermines the central role I've claimed that the reality assumption plays. Maybe before you read a work and you don't know what genre it's in, you should assume anything at all might obtain, right? Anything at all could be storified. And then you should adopt the reality assumption only when you recognize that the story is realistic. And for other stories, you should rely on genre conventions or other kinds of interpretive strategies. So in reply to this concern, I say that genre conventions, as well as other strategies, are simply too limited in scope to generate most story truths. So here is an example. I imagine that you have some version of this fairy tale, The Princess and the Frog. But in any case, the beginning of The Princess and the Frog, in all the versions that I have looked at, starts out with a princess playing by a well with her precious golden ball. She drops the ball in the well. A frog offers to get the ball back for her if she will kiss him. And she says yes. He gets the ball. She refuses to kiss him and runs away. So that's the beginning of the fairy tale. Now, no version of the fairy tale tells us why the princess could not get the ball, why the frog could get the ball, why the princess doesn't want to kiss the frog. These things are not made explicit. And it's not in the fairy tale genre to tell you the answer to those questions. You know it because you know ordinary things like wells are small, she cannot swim, frogs can swim, frogs are a bit icky and disgusting to princesses, and so on. So it's your ordinary knowledge of reality that fills in the gaps and lets you understand even fairy tales where frogs talk and turn into princes. Okay. So that's the first objection I'll consider. The second objection is perhaps the most significant one, which is that the reality assumption generates lots of totally irrelevant story truths, right? Because it invites us to include all the truths and represent all the features of the real world in our situation models, that is, in our mental representations of the story world, except when they're excluded by the work. So, for example, in Candide, it will be storified that there was a major California earthquake in 1906. Now, Candide is written in the 18th century, so it's a bit surprising to think that in the world of Candide, there's a 1906 earthquake in California. It's also storified in Candide that there are subatomic particles, even though Voltaire could not have known about subatomic particles, and so on. So, according to me, every story includes vast collections of remote facts unknown to the author and completely immaterial to the narrative. So what do I say about that? Well, first of all, an invitation to imagine is not a mandate. We should normally simply ignore all these irrelevant story truths. But if the question came up and we had to decide between imagining, say, that there are subatomic particles in the world of Candide and that there are not subatomic particles in the world of Candide, then surely we should imagine that there are, because Candide is not a science fiction in which the physical laws of the universe are different. So whatever the physical laws of the universe are, those are the physical laws in the world of Candide, whether Voltaire knew or not. Similarly, we may find that certain kinds of story truths and certain truths are relevant in ways that we can't predict. So, for example, many people will be aware of the 1755 earthquake in Lisbon, which appears in chapter 5 of Candide, is part of Voltaire's argument that this is not the best of all possible worlds, and the fact that there were earthquakes later, much more devastating earthquakes, in fact, later on in history, is relevant to appreciating Voltaire's argument. So we shouldn't exclude those kinds of truths, even if an author is not aware of them. Now, of course, it would be very odd to say something like, in Candide, there are subatomic particles. I mean, no one would actually say that. But it would also be odd to say that about Da Cunha's Backlands, even though it's a work of nonfiction and we take for granted that this is the real world in a work of nonfiction. When we report what's actually the case in a story, we restrict ourselves to the important story truths. Okay, so that is my defense of the reality assumption, and now I want to consider how the reality assumption constitutes a constraint, a restriction on the creativity of authors. Okay. So what I've been focusing on is the way that the reality assumption allows us to fill in the gaps, supplying the background of a story so that we can understand what's going on. Since this is our default starting point, it's actually quite difficult for an author to get readers to imagine a completely different background for a story. That is a story that is not in any way set in the real world, one that has no overlap with anything that we're familiar with. We just tend automatically to fill in the gaps with what we know. And of course, authors know that, and authors who want to create story worlds that are dramatically different from the real world manage to do this, but they have to work quite hard. Okay? If a story had absolutely no overlap with anything that we're familiar with, it's very likely we wouldn't understand it at all. Okay, so that's a constraint. You can't actually go that far and still be understood. So the idea here is that even if we suspend our default assumption about a real background for some kind of domain, for example, physics, we don't suspend it for other domains in the story, like psychology. If Douglas Adams, in Hitchhiker's Guide, had wanted us to assume that the psychology was different, he would have had to have done quite a bit of work to get us to stop assuming that the characters are responding in the normal way. That's the idea. So authors, as I say, authors who want readers to imagine much more radically different story worlds must work very hard. This is true even with impossible fictions, even fictions that explicitly have contradictions on purpose. We tend to work all the time trying to make sense of it in terms of something that we know. So even having a kind